I think we'll start. So welcome, everybody. This is really exciting that so many people are interested in this topic and have had an opportunity to come here tonight. And I do have to mention that I am from Chicago, and the Cubs are in the World Series, and they're starting that tonight. So for those of you who have come and will be going to watch that later, I'm particularly happy that you're here. So I wanted to start off by, well, this event is called The Politics of Documenting Neighborhood Change. I wanted to start off by thanking the people who make our events possible at the Urban Democracy Lab and at Gallatin. And those people are our dean, Suzanne Wofford, Jason Lanning, who's our admin aide, who's over there and made sure all the technology and seats were here, Sierra Dismore, who works in this building and also helps us get everything set up, Tristan Oliveira, who's our videographer, Alex Ma, who's our photographer, and all the other people that I haven't mentioned, and of course our panelists. So thanks everybody for being here. So you may not know the history of this panel, but this panel came about because all of us will be presenting at the American Studies Association conference next month on exactly the same topic, and we thought it would be really fun to begin the conversation here in New York with our communities. And get some feedback from you about what we have to say and what direction we're going in with our own projects. So this was going to be a practice session, but now we have such a great audience. This could be the big session. So I'll introduce everybody here, and then we'll get started. Great. All right. So Zahir Ali, who is second from the end, is the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, where he records, collects, archives, and curates the lived histories, testimonies, memoirs, and narrations of Brooklynites from all walks of life. In this capacity, he directs Voices of Generations, investigating Brooklyn's cultural identity, a project to digitize, process, catalog, and make accessible online nearly 500 interviews that are part of 10 oral history collections. And he directs Voices of Crown Heights, which he'll be talking about this evening, a multi-year oral history project on the history and future of the Brooklyn neighborhood of Crown Heights. Additionally, he co-hosts and co-produces Flatbush in Maine, Brooklyn Historical Society's monthly podcast, which is really cool, dedicated to Brooklyn's multi-layered histories and dynamic present. He's finishing his doctoral studies in history at Columbia University, and we're really excited that he's here this evening. Heather Dalmage is here from Chicago. She's a professor of sociology and director of the Mansfield Institute for Social Justice. She has authored 4 books and is a former Fulbright Scholar to South Africa. She serves on the Illinois Attorney General Committee on Special Education, the Board of Education for the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, and on the board of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Dalmage is also an associate editor of the Journal of Social Problems, is on the editorial collective of Societies Without Borders, and recently co-edited a special edition of the journal Sociological Imagination on post-Mandela South Africa. Max Holleran, right here, is an urban and cultural sociologist interested in European Union issues and the evolution of the European periphery from Southern to Eastern Europe. He has written on post-socialist architecture and urban planning, the relationship between architecture and political change and tourism. I believe this fall he will be defending his dissertation, Europe's Exploding Edges, Real Estate, Speculation, Tourism, and the Shifting Periphery of the EU. And Jack Chen, who will be moderating this discussion, is a facilitator, teacher, and he's sitting right here, is a facilitator, teacher, historian, curator, reorganizer, and dumpster diver. He works on understanding the multiple presents, past, and the futures of New York City, identity formations, translocal cross-cultural communications, archives and epistemologies, and progressive pedagogy. He does a lot of stuff. He wants me to stop. But you should know a couple of things about him. He's the founding director of the Asian Pacific American APA Studies Program and Institute at NYU, and they're doing a really great project on wayfinding and the Lenape Trail here in New York, and you'll probably see it in lots of places around here, little iterations of it. And he co-founded the Museum of Chinese in America, which is also a very important institution. And finally, there's me. And I'm the associate director of the Urban Democracy Lab, and I'm a historian, and I'll be talking about my project shortly. So thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Max.
Thank you. So what I want to do is just really quickly go over some of the kind of foundational texts in urban ethnography, because part of what we're doing today is talking about different ways of academic interventions in neighborhoods. I'm a sociologist and I'm an urban ethnographer. I kind of want to tell you a little bit about what urban ethnography tries to do when it goes into neighborhoods, how it does it, and then to make some predictions about whether it's doing it well or not, and how it could go a little bit differently. My work is in, as Becky mentioned, is about tourism development, and it's not based in the US. So I thought I would save you all a long and tedious explanation of tourism development from the 60s onward in the European Union, and just use some examples from American sociology that at this point are more or less canonical, and which talk about cities and neighborhoods, and were done in ways that interacted with residents of those neighborhoods, but sometimes merely to put out a book and not to change the problems in those people's lives. So first I should probably say what ethnography is. There's a really common definition that a lot of sociologists like to use for its simplicity, and that's deep hanging out, which is instead of asking people questions about their lives and asking them about the neighborhoods that they live in, you go to those neighborhoods, you get in with a group of people who live in those neighborhoods, and then you hang out with them and you explore what their life is like on a daily basis. And this tries to take away the kind of prejudice that people have when they talk about their own life stories, and it also uses academics in the sort of anthropological sense, where they're getting into situations that seem very far away from your daily life and very far away from the life of the reader. However, unlike anthropology, this is something that happens in American cities, most notably Chicago, and usually in places with high poverty, high crime, and a lot of what we think of as social problems. But in some senses, it really still is that kind of anthropological look at extended kin groups and their rituals and their theories of the world, which might be very different from the kind of mainstream academic reader and their theories of the world. And so a lot of what sociologists were trying to do at the very beginning is not so different from social work, in the sense they're actually trying to improve conditions in neighborhoods by working with nonprofit groups. And it also wasn't that different from what urban planners are doing, which is looking at different configurations of neighborhoods and how people interact in them. So Chicago, despite not producing a very good baseball team, has produced, is the birthplace of American sociology and the birthplace of American urban sociology. And this is actually, this sort of inelegant hand drawing is one of the most famous pictures of that sociology, which is a theory of the neighborhoods in the city in concentric zones and how those zones interact with each other. And it's basically a map of early zoning, which is where people live, high crime neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, and neighborhoods where people are either working in factories or transporting products that come from factories. And so this is the Park and Burgess model made in the early 1920s, and it really used a lot of natural and biological metaphors for looking at neighborhoods. So neighborhoods were usually seen as static things that didn't really alter very much, and people kind of went in and out of them. And so it was really good at showing interaction, but it wasn't really good at showing this as a place that could potentially change. So in some sense, this also really put a focus on people instead of urban forms. Unlike architectural studies, it really became about the people themselves and not trying to personify buildings and give buildings a life of their own. It was the people center, and the places that they interacted in was really just settings and kind of sets like what you'd think of in a play. This is one of the most famous urban ethnographies from the 1940s. And like so many ethnographies, it's a study of deviance. And it comes from a model of urban development and of urban sociology, where it's really trying to solve those problems and to interact with community groups in ways that are supposed to help them get through their work. And this comes from the two most famous sociologists of neighborhoods. One is Jane Addams, who operated an Uplift Center, the Hull House in Chicago, and the other person is W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote extensively about Philadelphia and Philadelphia's black population using census material from the early 20th century. So you can see, maybe you can't see, it's called Corner Gangs, Racket and Political Organizations, Their Leadership and Control in an Italian-American Slum. And even though it's Boston, it has a very sort of like windy city feeling to it. And it's a study of youth gangs and how they interact within the city. And in many ways, the book is really a study of assimilation. And it takes the people who are studied in this time in the early 1940s in Boston and sort of assigns them to two basic groups. One are the sort of street people and one are the decent people. And that's using sociological language that kind of came about later, but it's basically people who will conform to the standards of mainstream society and those who will not. And so there's always been a kind of level of judgment in these studies where there are people who will get with the program and who will get off the street corner eventually and get out of the social clubs, and then there are people who will not do that. And I should say that the author of this book, who became a very famous sociologist, also was really involved in the political campaign of one of his informants, working in that political campaign, and eventually seeing this guy get elected to be an alderman in Boston. And so the way in which this kind of evolved is that people then assumed that it was actually a pretty bad thing to get involved in the lives of informants and to get involved in neighborhood institutions and community groups because of the potential of contaminating your objects of study and therefore having a sort of inexact sample that you couldn't use to talk about neighborhoods in general. So it became much more common to have ethnographers who interacted with their subjects for a time and then took themselves out of the neighborhood and usually did not contribute to any of the neighborhood groups in that neighborhood. This became problematic because some of the people who were working in these cities used neighborhood groups only as points of access and not really delivering anything in return for the access that was given to them of that population. This is another very famous book about East Harlem in 1995 that became a bestseller and also is something that is part of what used to be called deviant studies and now is probably more called social problems. And the book is about someone who's from the kind of right side of the tracks, this being the tracks of Metro North, from the Upper East Side, who is let into access of people selling drugs from 96th Street to 110th Street on the East Side. And it was written in 1995 at a time in which it was seen as sort of the nadir of that neighborhood, but really was right on the verge of neighborhood change. So one thing about ethnography is because it's based on one person going to that neighborhood and trying to see that neighborhood in the sort of discrete piece of time when the study takes place, it's been really bad in predictive sense, which is that the book was written in 95, and just a few years later, East Harlem went from this to this. And there's really very little mention of that in the book. And so in that sense, ethnography has problems in that historically, it usually doesn't bother much to go through the neighborhood before the academic arrived on the scene. In terms of predictive outcomes, it sometimes gets those things very wrong. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the ways in which this has evolved. I think I'll skip over Jane Jacobs here, but the kind of model of neighborhood activism has been stronger in the past in urban ethnography. I think that's something we can talk about in the Q&A period, which is that this is a sort of 60s and 70s idea of you go into a neighborhood and you try to work with neighborhood groups in a preventative way. In this case, it was to prevent a highway being plowed through Washington Square Park. And now the model has been much more geared towards looking at neighborhoods without getting involved in their politics because of a sense of discomfort or a sense of that being an overbearing thing that educated academics do and not something that's necessarily useful to the lives of the people in those neighborhoods. And again, although Jane Jacobs is really good at showing us the beauty of the West Village and the intricacy in which people interacted socially in the 1960s and 1970s, she did not predict the neighborhood change that was coming to the West Village, from a tight-knit Italian community to a bohemian community, and finally to one of the most expensive places in the world with its representative for tourism. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm getting the decapitation signal. But we can talk a little bit more about kind of contemporary ethnography if people are interested. Thank you.
I think I'll stand here just because I'm short and there's a hole there. Is this working? Yeah. So hello, I am Heather Dolmage. I'm from Chicago, and I'm not a baseball fan, so I hear there is a game. I want to thank Rebecca for inviting me. I always loved to come to New York. I got my PhD here up the street back when the Grad Center was on 42nd Street, and I went to the new Grad Center today, which is no longer so new. I want to talk with you about research that we did in Chicago in two primary areas on the southwest side and the west side. Historically, these were the segregated white communities where white ethnics moved when they came into Chicago. It's where Dr. King brought the freedom marches in the 60s when, you know, he looked north and he saw just how entrenched racism and segregation was in the north. So one of the areas he brought the marches was through Marquette Park, and that's on the southwest side in Chicago. And on the 40th anniversary of those marches in 2008, the Chicago Tribune had a magazine cover, and on the front cover was a photo of Dr. King, and there was a white man, and he looked like he was tackling Dr. King. And I just like had a visceral reaction to it, like, you know, take your hands off of him. That's so disrespectful, and beyond disrespectful. And then I read the underlying print, and it said, this is Pastor so-and-so. Forgive me for not knowing, because I should know who this man is. Pastor so-and-so. And he was actually covering Dr. King because somebody was throwing a brick at him. And so he took the brick for Dr. King. So it completely changed the way I was looking at that dynamic. But what I noticed in the process were all of these white people standing along the side in this photo, and their faces were twisted and angry, and there were children there. And I started thinking, my God, there's women, there's men, there's children. These people are all going to go home tonight. They're going to make dinner. They're going to tuck their children in. They're going to change diapers. They're going to kiss somebody and say, I love you. And these same people right now are just teaching their children the worst kind of hate taught in the context of love, right? So these are loving relationships, and they're teaching their children how to hate. So we decided we needed to understand how these children grew up to understand race, because we felt like what happened once the neighborhoods began to become integrated is the Catholic parishes sort of closed shop. Many of them moved in groups out to the suburbs, and these white neighborhoods were no longer there. So these white children that grew up in these neighborhoods no longer existed except in their memories. And so what we wanted to understand is how they made sense of the hatefulness that they were taught, how that reflected in their racial identities today, and given that race was lived explicitly back in the 60s, but then we moved into this colorblind era, right, from the 80s forward, then how were they going to talk about and make sense of their ideas in a colorblind era, looking back on a time when they lived race explicitly? So we were trying to figure out all of these pieces. And I can talk to you about the findings of the research. It's since been written up in a book called Vanishing Eden, Temple University Press. But I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of what we faced in the sort of the ethical questions that we faced in conducting this research, and primarily the central question that we kept coming back to over and over is we wanted to interview these white now adults, who grew up in these neighborhoods. And we needed a snowball sample because we didn't have access to all of these different people, and they were living in all different places. And so we had to build trust in the context of an interview. And my co-author, Mike Malley, a man, me, a white woman, we would go to these interviews and we would say, let's say we would be interviewing with a priest. And the priest would say something. And the two of us would say, oh, we were raised Catholic. Not a lie. We were raised Catholic. We're no longer Catholic, but we weren't going to tell the priest this, right? We were raised Catholic. We started interviewing all along the way, and we would interview men. And what we discovered, and we did about the first 15 interviews together, we would interview men, and men would spend the entire interview looking at my co-author, Mike. They would not make eye contact with me. They wouldn't. If I asked a question, it was like it just pinged around the room, waiting for some ears to land on, that he would almost have to say the question, and then they would respond. So then, when we interviewed women, it was the same response in reverse. So then we decided outside of focus groups that we just needed to split up, that there was definitely this gender piece that we needed to deal with. But the race piece became really interesting because what we were hearing in the context of these interviews around how people were making sense of community and identity was very racist. Often they would say explicitly racist statements. And we had to decide how we were going to interact with that relative to trying to understand the community and branching out and all of that sort of thing. And so we ultimately ended up doing what we called nodding passing. We would nod. They would say something and we would nod. And the nod is enough. Anybody that studies sort of communication, right? That nod, somebody's talking, it means keep talking, right? I'm following you, I'm listening. So I'm not saying I agree or disagree, I'm listening. So that's how we decided to get ourselves through some interviews and allow the snowballing to happen. There were many times I wanted to stop interviews based on what people were saying, and there was many times where I was concerned for our safety, my safety in particular, when we would go into, anyone here from Chicago? Okay, Mount Greenwood mean anything to you? No. Okay, Mount Greenwood is an area in Chicago. We have a rule in Chicago that if you're going to be a school teacher, a firefighter, or a cop, you have to live in the city boundaries. So there are a few communities, Harwood Heights, Mount Greenwood. These communities are known to be intensely racist areas, predominantly white areas, where there's all kinds of literal policing that goes on from the front porch to make sure those neighborhoods stay white, and that is where the white cops, teachers, and firefighters live. So we had snowballed into Mount Greenwood, and I'm sitting in a living room with a firefighter, 2 police officers, and a school teacher, and they were all family, all living in Mount Greenwood. And my family is black, I am white, and if any one of them had Googled me, they would have known that in a second. So I sort of had this uneasy passing anxiety going into it. You're not going to go too on me, are you? Because it's a good story. Okay. It's 3, okay. So I kind of had this uneasy passing, like, anxiety walking in, and the first guy meets me at the door and he says, "Do you want some heroin?" I'm like, what? Have you ever been to an interview where somebody offers you heroin when you walk in? It's like, my God, where am I? So the heroin never materialized, ever, in the course of the evening, but lots of beer did. And every time, like, they would finish talking, he would do this thing where he'd crunch up a can, and then he would yell, "Billy!" There was a whole room of kids playing at the other end of the house. "Billy, give me another beer!" And the kid just kept, and he's sitting with a laptop on his lap. And the whole time I'm thinking, please don't Google me, just please don't Google me. I have interviewed whites in South Africa. These whites it was a rough interview and a very scary interview. But what we learned in the way that they took us sort of to the very explicit and the very extreme is it helped us to understand a lot of concepts. It helped us to put into context what we had been hearing from other people in more, in kinder ways. And so I'm just going to share with you 2 of our primary findings coming out of the analysis of whites who, okay, I got this. one per minute. What we found coming out of all of this interviewing around the concept of community and what happened with these whites who had grown up in these racially segregated communities and lived through the racial change, two things. That there are two primary tools that whites call on, or strategies that whites call on, in order to maintain a sense of goodness, a sense of moral upstanding, at the same time that they buy into, enact, or embrace white supremacy. So the first one is nostalgia. And what we heard over and over from the folks that we interviewed was, you know, when we were kids, everything was beautiful. We could walk out on our front porch and yell baseball, and we would have a baseball game in 5 minutes. All the kids would come running. We could go into anybody else's house, and their mother would feed us. It was like they were laying out this idyllic community that they grew up in, and all of these nostalgia tales ended with one word: until the first black family moved in. And that was the defining moment for each one of these constructions of nostalgia. In other words, the beautiful communities, these beautiful white segregated communities, what they understood and the way that nostalgia was working, where they were destroyed by blackness. So that leads to the second part of the second strategy, and they're interrelated, so just stay with me for a second, and that is bounded empathy. What we heard very often from this generation that we interviewed is, you know what, we made it to college, so we have exposure, we have education, we interact with other people, but our grandparents, they didn't. Our parents, they didn't. But what they did is they lost their homes. Every time the neighborhood changed, they lost their homes. They lost money because the panic peddlers came in and they underpaid our parents for what the houses were worth. It doesn't matter, you know, the other end of it doesn't get talked about, that blacks overpaid for those homes. Yeah, I got it. Okay, super quick. So what they would say is, so when Uncle Joe is racist, you know what? I understand why Uncle Joe's racist, and I accept him because I'm a good person and I have empathy for Uncle Joe, so I embrace him. And what that does, that bounded empathy, is it allows for whiteness to expand to include white supremacists and racist thinking in a way that allows whites to think of themselves as good and empathetic and educated and exposed, and through those processes they are embracing and accepting others. So we can talk more, and I turn the mic over to Zahir.
Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Thank you, Becky, for arranging this, and thank you all for coming out. I'm going to talk a little fast because I have some media clips that I want to show, and I want to try to get all of my points in. I am the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, which is a 153-year-old urban history center in Brooklyn. And as the oral historian, I am responsible for curating our existing collections and also collecting new oral histories. And the project that I want to talk about is a project that we just launched this year called Voices of Crown Heights. Crown Heights is one of the fastest changing neighborhoods in Brooklyn. If you're familiar with the geography of Brooklyn, it's kind of like it was first Williamsburg got gentrified, and people who couldn't live in Williamsburg moved out to Bushwick and then to Bed-Stuy, and now people who can't afford to live in Bed-Stuy are moving south to Crown Heights, and then people are even going further south to Flatbush. So this is the kind of a sprawl of gentrification. The other reason why Crown Heights is special is because 20 years ago, it was the site of, depending on how you view it, a riot, an uprising, unrest, violence, and there's a whole kind of conversation to be had about how we refer to these events, which we're not going to have that conversation in the context of my presentation. But what happened in August of '91, a young Afro-Guyanese child named Gavin Cato was killed after a car driven by a Hasidic Jewish man ran a red light and pinned him to a wall. He died, and this kind of unleashed what had been growing tensions in that neighborhood between the African American, Afro-Caribbean, and Hasidic Jewish communities that make up Crown Heights. In the ensuing violence of 3 days, a Jewish student named Yankel Rosenbaum was stabbed to death. And this became known as the Crown Heights riots. It was very significant in the history of New York. Many people, had very different opinions about what had happened or what should have happened. Most historians credit what happened with the Crown Heights incident with the undoing of Mayor Dinkins' attempt to gain re-election as the first black mayor of New York. So it was fairly significant in the context of New York City politics. In terms of national politics during this time, there is a kind of national discourse happening around black-Jewish relations, so that kind of framed how people understood what was happening in the neighborhood. But I wanted to look at this on this occasion to think about how this riot figures in the history of the neighborhood. So it's interesting that Heather talked about how integration kind of marked the end of the history of these neighborhoods. In this instance, the riot marks the beginning of the history of Crown Heights because it has functioned in gentrification narratives as a kind of ground zero from which recovery has happened that we should all celebrate. And so you can see here are some, just recent articles. Crown Heights gets its turn, Crown Heights still thrives, a rebirth of Crown Heights. If you read the articles, you get, the neighborhood has finally overcome a reputation for intolerance and violence that plagued it. And, residents credit the successful post-riot reconciliation. This is not the same Crown Heights that made headlines in the 1990s. So again, this event is kind of like the beginning of this neighborhood's history as far as Crown Heights is concerned. But, that's not true, of course. We know this neighborhood has a much longer history, and that should not be collapsed into this one event. And even the event itself did not come out of nowhere. And so for the Voices of Crown Heights project, we wanted to kind of explore that. So I want to take a little bit of a detour and play a clip of a kind of cautionary experience that I had. No shade on the New York Times, but as the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, and our public history department is often called upon to talk about the history of Brooklyn neighborhoods. And one of the most popular sites that does this is Brownstoner. If you're familiar with brownstoner.com, it is a kind of part history blog, part real estate blog, right? So this is the kind of ethical issue of where does our work as a public history institution intersect with the work of real estate brokers and developers seeking to market that history as they sell these neighborhoods. And so I had to do, I did an interview for the New York Times. They have this series called Block by Block, where they focus on different neighborhoods. And this particular interview was on Fort Greene. And I'm gonna play a clip of how that interview turned out, and you'll see how my attempt to talk about the rich history of Fort Greene is packaged and situated. And to be upfront, I knew this was part of their real estate section, so it's not like I was bamboozled or hoodwinked. I kind of, but it's important for us to be aware of how the history functions. Okay. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll come back to that slide. But from its earliest developments, Fort Greene had two kinds of communities settling. You had elites building elaborate houses south of the park, and you had working class people settling in the northern part of the neighborhood. For African Americans, their history in Fort Greene extended from the earliest founding. So I'm gonna jump around because I don't want to eat my time. That they did in the 60s, began moving in somewhat, one group that began moving in somewhat larger numbers was a growing black creative class. One of the most critical artists in this movement was Spike Lee. Okay, so my segment ends this way.
furniture has become extremely competitive. There's just not enough real estate to go around.
So I just did a commercial for the selling of real estate in Fort Greene. And so in approaching the Crown Heights project, I wanted to make sure that that's not what we're doing, right? That we are documenting the rich history of this neighborhood primarily to amplify the voices of people who live there and the histories of the people who live there, who live, work, and play in Crown Heights for the purposes of them kind of staking a claim on their neighborhood. One of my favorite quotes from Michel de Certeau is that, the story's first function is to authorize, or more exactly to found, that before you have a place, you have a story about the place. And so I'm interested in what stories people have to tell about the places in which they live. Okay, so I'm gonna jump around here because I don't want to, okay. So here is, for people who aren't familiar with the geography, this is Brooklyn and this is Crown Heights in this, in this square. And up in the left, upper left-hand corner is Brooklyn Historical Society. So you see we are not, of course we're not too far. It's like a 20-minute subway ride, but we're not in Crown Heights. And we're very conscious of what that means, right? We're Brooklyn Historical Society. We represent all of Brooklyn. We have done work throughout the borough, but it's really important that the work that we do have a kind of physical and geographical connection with the neighborhood. I live in Crown Heights, but that's not enough. And so the way that we've designed this project is around the concept of listening. And what does it mean to be an institution that listens to the unheard voices? Martin King had this quote in 1966 that a riot is the language of the unheard. And there's an oral historian named Alessandra Portelli who said, oral history is essentially the art of listening. So our kind of guiding concept for this project is listening to the unheard. We do not believe in giving voice to the voiceless because everyone has a voice. They're just not heard, or those voices are not amplified. And so we're giving ears to the earless, right? So we've designed this project and to kind of counter some of the tendencies that could lead to commodifying a neighborhood, or the kind of mercenary kind of positioning that Max talked about. And this is what we've done. So one, establish capacity building community partnerships with communities, organizations that either are in Crown Heights or do work in Crown Heights. And so we identified two: Weeksville Heritage Center, which is kind of based around one of the oldest Black settlements in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn Movement Center, which is an activist organization. And when we say capacity building, this project has been funded generously by the New York Community Trust and the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and we built into the grant money for these organizations, just like straight up money, like no questions asked. Here's an honorarium because we respect your time. We're asking you to do certain things, and we know that you need resources for it. We have also included in our partnerships workshops on how to do research on the neighborhood, and also how to do oral history work, how to do oral histories, because we want to enjoin these organizations to do the work as our partner, right? So we're not just coming in to do the oral histories. We want to train them to do the oral histories within their own community and use the oral histories as a way to advance their own work. So Weeksville Heritage Center is focused on education and history of education and independent education in Crown Heights, and Brooklyn Movement Center on the history of policing. We focus on the histories of resistance and resistant histories, and I mean the ways that people have organized resilience to the changes in their neighborhood. And when I say resistant histories, I mean market resistant histories. So it's not just all like flowers and urban gardens. We're looking at the longer history of police-community relations. We're looking at the long history of tenant organizing, and looking at overlooked voices and labor, the work that people have done to transform their neighborhood. And finally, an exercise in counter-hegemonic mapping. And by that I mean we are going to be constructing a map based on people's oral histories. where they lived, where they played, where they conducted their, this corner was important to us, this playground was important to us. I just interviewed an activist last week who talked about peace zones that he created throughout the neighborhood. And so we're going to create a counter map to the map that developers are using and the city is using to kind of sell the neighborhood, that roots the neighborhood's map in the stories of the lived experiences of the people. I have other clips, but my time is up, and if we have time, I can play them, but thank you so much. All right.
Okay. All right, so I'm actually going to be talking I'm going to be talking about a project, oops, it went backwards. Talking about a project that sounds very similar actually to what Zahir is working on, except done on a $500 budget in a classroom with me as the person running the whole show. So I wanted to, first of all, acknowledge a couple of the people who were in the room who actually were part of the class, either as collaborators from the community or people who were in my classroom. So I know you're out there. I don't know exactly where you are, but I saw you earlier, so I'm glad you're here. And their stories are as important as the story I'm about to tell you. So this presentation is about a collaboration that I managed between students in my course, undergraduate students at NYU, a course called Displaced Urban Histories, and with the staff at Southside United HDFC, also known as Los Suras, and residents of the south side of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, also known as Los Suras. And that leads me to that slide, which explains Los Suras and Los Suras. Why do I refer to these two places? Well, one is an organization and one is a neighborhood. So I wanted to clarify that for you first. So Los Suras is a term used by people who live in a particular neighborhood of the south side of Williamsburg. You can't really see it very well here, but it's this little white section on the map that is numbered 1. And I tried to clarify it here a bit. It's metropolitan to Division, the waterfront to Union Avenue. The population is about 30,000 people. The poverty rate is between 13% and 47%, and that is interesting as kind of like a measurement of gentrification, right? So the 13% is at the northern end, the part closest to North Williamsburg, which is a highly gentrified neighborhood, or just over, it's over. And the 47% is moving further south. The race ethnicity of the area is, again, reflecting gentrification, but the area between Grand and South 4th is 50 to 75% Latino, primarily Puerto Rican and Dominican, although there are Latinos from lots of other places in Latin America. And this data is from the 2010 census and the American Community Survey of 2014. So that's the neighborhood that we're talking about. We're also talking about a community-based organization that is known as Southside United and also Los Suras. And you don't need to read all this information because we only have a few minutes, but basically Los Suras, the organization, was founded in 1972 at a time when the neighborhood was basically abandoned by government, by people who owned property, landlords, by industry. Industry was leaving the area. And so this was an area that really needed to help itself because nobody else was going to help. And Los Suras was an organization that grew out of that. And they basically bought up a bunch of buildings, rehabilitated them, and made them into affordable housing, which they now manage for the community. And then they additionally have social services, mainly for seniors, tenant advocacy, and then they wanted to add this kind of cultural arm in the last few years, which includes El Museo de Los Suras, which is the exhibit space where we put on an exhibit as part of my course. So what was this course about? and I'll tell you some of the objectives. This course was basically about trying to address the ways in which we talk about gentrification at NYU or amongst people who have more affluence. We tend to talk about gentrification as if it's a cultural phenomenon or an inevitable phenomenon. When we describe it, we talk about hipsters, we talk about new restaurants and things like that. And we talk about it less as a rights issue, as an issue of the right to the city, as the right to housing, the right to receive city services. And so I'm interested in talking about it in this way. And for those of you who think about right to the city, of course, you know this is Henri Lefebvre, this is David Harvey, these are things that they're talking about. I also didn't like the way that we talked about gentrification ahistorically, so as if this is something that just happened, and somehow it just rose from, from nothing. So the purpose of this course was to historicize the process and figure out what happened before gentrification that opened the door for this process to happen. And then finally, I wanted to kind of produce an opportunity for students at NYU, many of whom tend to be more affluent, to have a chance to understand gentrification from the side of the people who are being displaced, who are, fearing displacement. And then maybe to politicize my students a little bit and question their privilege. So I taught this course twice, in the spring of 2015 and in 2016, and so I wrote these little objectives that we completed in 2015. The idea was to, and this happened in both cases, we read theories of gentrification, and there's a lot of theory, mostly from sociology and anthropology on this topic, and geography on this topic. In the first iteration, we conducted archival and secondary research on the history of Williamsburg and Bushwick because the neighborhoods are so linked together demographically and historically. And then they produced an exhibit at El Museo that was basically built on the themes of industry, housing, resilience, artists, and demography. And I'll show you some pictures in a moment from that exhibit. And then the second iteration, I rethought it, and I decided to continue to talk about theories of gentrification, but then in our partnership with Los Suras, I don't know if I mentioned that we partnered with Los Suras the whole time, but in our partnership this time, we partnered with individuals who were longtime residents of the neighborhood, and the organization helped to recruit people. We found people as well, and each of my 13 students was matched with a longtime resident to interview and to take a life history and to collect artifacts of that individual's life to archive. And from that, we created an exhibit online and at El Museo that documented these lives. So here's some images. This is from the first version, which was pretty cool looking. There was a lot of spray paint involved. So you can see we had a couple of interactives. 1850 was a little far back in history for people to be able to add to our timeline, but we did our best. You can see 1850 and a person writing something to add to the timelines that were interactive. You could write on the wall. We had some images on resiliency, and then you can see the opening night here, and this is another interactive where people could reimagine the Williamsburg waterfront to not include luxury apartments. It was, that was as close as we could get to not imagining luxury apartments. And then this is the second version. And this one, as you can see, is much more focused on individual people's lives. So you have a portrait of a person, you have a quotation, which you could then use the QR code to go listen to the oral history recording, and then some items from that person's life. And then there are these other interactives where you can write on these little postcards and Post-it notes. And very similar to what you're saying, Zahir, we had people identify places that were of importance to them. And we have this little interactive here where we put these places on the wall, and then you could write something that you remembered about it. And then finally, in our effort to be a little bit more activist, we created these postcards that were pre-labeled to go to various city officials. And you could come to the exhibit, write something on the back of the postcard, and mail it off to Eric Adams or whoever you wanted to get the attention of. So that happened second time. And then these are a couple of screenshots of the digital archive that we produced as well. using a program called Omeka, which is very easy to use, very low threshold for learning. And we have 153 items, photographs, oral histories, transcripts, newspaper articles. And this is just a screenshot of some images about the rezoning. So you can see that. And here's the URL if you ever want to look at it, and I have it again at the end of this presentation. So I was particularly happy with the second iteration of the course because it was brought together in a way that was much more collaborative. So not only were we working with the organization and having these oral history collaborations, but we were also doing workshops with residents of the neighborhood when they could come to meet with my class. So my class and I would go out to Williamsburg, go to a community center, meet with a lot of residents. Usually they were the senior citizens because they could meet on Friday afternoons. And we would do oral history workshops, and we talked about how we were going to put the exhibit together. We discussed gentrification. One of the things that was particularly interesting to me was the fact that the word gentrification wasn't a word that people were using in the neighborhood. It was a word that we were using, but they saw it as change or newcomers, or displacement wasn't a term that they were unfamiliar with. So I thought that was really interesting. And it was an opportunity for all of us to kind of learn together. So it was really, I think, democratizing the process of putting history together. I threw in these couple of quotations, but you can also access them another way if you want to go to our website. These are just a couple of ideas of what kind of information we were getting, which were usually, like, this is my personal experience with displacement. First of all, I can't be displaced because I can't move. I can't move anyplace else. I can only afford the one place that I have, and that's where my granddaughter has to live too. So this kind of quotation kind of captures that. Another quotation, this one was from a younger person who said, this was all happening in my 20s, and I started to wonder, why are they building new buildings for all these people when we need new buildings too? So these are the kinds of things that we were really able to capture from our students. So anyway, this is my little section called So What Did I Do This Summer? And I was thinking about all of this work that we did and trying to figure out what it all meant. And I came up with a bunch of questions. So I'm just going to throw them all up there since I've also gotten the decapitation sign. So basically, the questions that I came up with at the end of all of this were basically, so what? Now we've done this great exhibit. It was over. People aren't really all that internet savvy. A lot of the senior citizens we were working with, they're not going to go listen to their oral histories. The exhibit ended in mid-May. We had a nice group of people who came, but then they went home. And is this an activist or political move that we've done with this exhibit? Did those postcards do anything? Does documenting these histories do anything to save people from losing their homes? So these are kind of the questions I was interested in. And then as well, so here's a question about, is this kind of, quaint history actually forwarding the cause of gentrification? Is it really attracting people? Are people kind of commodifying these histories in some way? So anyway, I will leave you with those questions. I'm sure we'll all discuss many of these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry for this awkward kind of arrangement, but I'll try to stand so we can see. But I think my role is to maybe just get this discussion started, but I can see that there's going to be a lot of questions and points that people want to add on to here. In some ways, it's kind of I think it's an interesting movement of the two sets of presentations. In some ways, one giving us a little bit of a sense of perhaps a history of how studies have done, and especially, Max, you're representing the University of Chicago kind of classic ecological model that Park and Burgess represented. I don't know if there's a way of kind of bringing that back up, but I'd love for us to see that here. And I'm not sure all of you over here can see that. But in some ways, I just want to reference that because it really is not just hearkening back to a certain kind of notion of zoning and planning, but the shadow that's there is really a eugenics tradition in terms of how really the larger context of zoning policy, but also kind of the way common sense knowledge was formulated. So the eugenics component of that, of course, okay, this is it right here, and I hope you can all take a look at this. It's really quite important. The eugenics context of this is really this sense that it's not just an ecological zone, but in some ways it's a natural cycle in which you start from the core of the urban area, which is the ghetto. You can't all read this necessarily. Chinatown is in there. The Loop is in there. Little Sicily is in there. And then you have this progressive sense of zones of transitions as you go further and further away from that core. So the core necessarily has this core of vice, and it's the core of ghettoization. And then the language of eugenics is that if you're adjacent to a ghetto or perhaps a slum, we can kind of play with these words more carefully, then you're vulnerable to blight. And this is the language of eugenics. So if you're vulnerable to blight, then this intermingling that happens can promote and precipitate racial degeneration. And also other kinds of natural forms of degeneration which have to do with perhaps Mongoloid's disease or Mongolian idiocy. We talk about Down syndrome, in which somehow there's a degeneration naturally happening that we don't fully understand, in which one person is actually degenerating, a nice white person is degenerating to a Mongoloid form. So there's already a built-in sense of a racial hierarchy, and that if a white person intermingles and intermarries with a Mongolian, then they're going to degenerate, their children are going to degenerate to the lower racial form, right? So a lot of this is really being driven here, but maybe not so explicitly stated. But as you get to the outer rings, you have the commuter zone, the bungalow section, the single-family dwellings, light happening, so the sense of decongestion. And really what's driving all this in many ways is a lot of policy around highways. Of course, we think of redlining as all part of this, but it's trying to put it in a greater context. So after all, 1924 is when the eugenics-informed immigration law is created, so that the numbers of Nordics, Northern and Western Europeans supposedly, is kind of amplified, and those who are of Alpine or Eastern European, Jewish background, that number drops off the cliff. And the same certainly with Mediterranean, so-called inferior Mediterraneans, who are the Italians, Greeks, other people. So that those categories of Alpines and Mediterraneans basically are not allowed to come here in very small numbers from 1924 to 1965, right? So I think a lot of the backdrop for this has to be understood in that way. So I guess I wanted to kind of maybe just start out the question with, some of the questions to the panelists with this sense of, so in some ways we're talking about moments in which there are dramatic changes and moments of white flight and kind of discourses of what's happening nostalgically, what we used to be, and what's happening now, and therefore in some ways setting up the justification for the need to go further and further out. And I guess I wanted to ask kind of a flip side question. Peter Maris, who's a British sociologist, wrote really, I think, a very important book that maybe is not known very much now, called Loss and Change. But in some ways I'm channeling the current ability of Donald Trump to kind of appeal to a certain kind of demographic that in some ways is very counterintuitive from the surface of things. But this sense of loss and this sense of that's not simply nostalgic, but also a very material transformation in terms of the shifting nature of the economy that's happening, a sense of being left out of changes that are going on. And his point is that unless people feel a part of how that change ultimately is going to, they're going to be a part of that change in a good way, or are they going to be left behind? So this issue of grievance and how do people, how does the grievance get addressed by policymakers or by activists is kind of a question in some ways that I think bridges these two first studies and then the two second studies. So in some ways, the organizational efforts to try to deal with that and to kind of think about this question of trust in terms of ongoing relationships and what roles do organizations actually play or not play? What roles do people who are doing this field work play or not play? And it does address this question of the circulation of knowledge. Who is this for? And how do those people of those communities actually gain some kind of reflexive sense of what's going on? It's a tough question. I'm not trying to ask that in some simplistic way, but I thought I'd kind of throw that out because it also addresses questions of process and questions that oral historians in many ways have been addressing in terms of questions of shared authority, but it's questions of authority really and the process of that. So maybe I'll throw that out as a way to start our discussion, then we can open it up.
So shall I? So in 1984, Reagan came into office, 80, and we shifted towards colorblindness at that point. In 1984, what whites who were still living on the southwest side and the west side in Chicago, what they decided they were going to do is develop a group-based identity. And so they decided that they would pull together white ethnics. They would reclaim their ethnic identity, and they would have a white ethnic convention, and then they would set up a white ethnic village. And their argument was that as white ethnics were being discriminated against, and therefore we have a platform just like blacks, just like Latinos, and therefore we're going to make that claim. What they couldn't counter were the larger trends that were in place, and that was where you all may have heard the metaphor of the wind at your back, you know, where whites have the wind at their back in society because the institutions are supporting white privilege and power. And if you're a runner or a biker, you know if the wind's at your back, you don't know it's there until you have to turn around and run into the wind. Then all of a sudden you're aware of the wind. Well, what happened to these white ethnics is it was sort of like they got a crosswind. And in Chicago, that's cold. It gets your attention. And what that was doing is it was redirecting whiteness because the institutions were no longer supporting whiteness in urban areas, but they were supporting it out in the suburbs. So that wind was pushing them that direction, but it was also getting their attention. And so these folks that wanted this white ethnic convention actually turned out to be generationally much older. And the younger generation were saying, forget it, we're going with the wind. We want to become middle-class whites. We want to become normal in that way, and we want to become educated, et cetera, et cetera. So they followed the wind, and sort of this white ethnic identity crumbled. But that Make America Great and, you know, Rush Limbaugh and then into Donald Trump, what they're calling on are those notions of nostalgia, that we at one time had these great spaces until, and we can have these great spaces again if only, right? And so they're calling on all of those discourses, but they're able to do that through the collective storytelling because those communities don't exist. They exist through storytelling. And the stories that are told over and over in the collective memory is told in such a way as to make those idyllic and anything that other than that is as an inferior or less than community.
I mean, I guess I want to push harder on this question because in some ways, oftentimes the discourse is around, well, are you appealing to that nostalgia and that kind of reactionary kind of sensibility, or are you part of a progressive movement? I mean, in some ways, that's the way Hillary versus Donald are framed. Now, part of what's complicating about eugenics, and this is where the Catholic Church is kind of interesting, is that eugenics was really part of the progressive movement. It was very much a top-down phenomenon. It was very much about a new kind of modern bureaucracy and a new kind of management of society. So in some ways, some of the pushback that people are now sensing and expressing actually is quite accurate and keen, but it's framed within other kinds of ideologies and other, you know. So I kind of want to push back a little bit and see. So is the solution on this somehow simply a progressive methodology, or somehow bringing light to these people who are caught up in nostalgia? You know, how do we unpack that and kind of deal with that? So I don't mean to ask you in particular, but maybe just asking in general. Yeah.
I guess that's interesting because you can think of gentrification can be framed in the way of improvement, of progress, right? Some people that we have interviewed, and including longtime residents, saying, yes, I like having better food choices in my neighborhood. I like that the neighborhood is safer, right? But they also have criticisms. Like, I acknowledge that the neighborhood has only become safer because of over-policing, and that these food choices have also have become more available because of who lives here, right? And so it's a complicated thing. I think one of the things is in terms of thinking about gentrification is very much the way people thought of progressivism, right? Like, on the one hand, it brought like improvements, but in many ways it kind of erased the labor of people who were already working there. And I think one of the things that's been important for us in terms of how we do this project is to both through research and through oral histories highlight the work. So like, we're interviewing people who, there's one interview with this guy saying, like, this corner right here was just like a junk pile. And people in the neighborhood got together and decided we were going to make it an urban garden, right? And they made it an urban garden, and the block became better. And now it's, prime real estate. Now, if you just come along after the development has been gone up, you're like, oh, this development is here. This is a nice apartment. But unless you have the story of the labor of the old residents who were part of the transformation. One of the things when we think about gentrification is that it erases the work of people who were already living in a neighborhood who were striving, oftentimes against the wind, to make a sustainable neighborhood through urban gardening, through tenant organizing, through community safety patrols. This was all happening in Crown Heights in the 70s and 80s. In fact, in 1985, the New York Times had this article saying Crown Heights is the place to be. So this is a cyclical thing. And so, like, I had this picture up of Crowbar, which is a bar that opened up in Crown Heights. And, the owner of the bar is a white guy who lives in Burham Hill, doesn't live in Crown Heights. And he said, I was doing research. We try to do research on the neighborhood when we were setting up a name, and there's not a lot of history on Crown Heights. So, Crown Heights was once known as Crow Hill, so I named it Crow Bar. Now, there's a lot of dispute about this, right? Crow Hill got its name, depending on who you ask, by the crows who were plentiful there, or in the mid-19th century because it was one of the earliest black settlements in Brooklyn. And if you're familiar with the national context, in the mid-19th century, the most popular form of entertainment was minstrelsy in the United States, and one of the most popular minstrels was Jim Crow, right? And so to not see that juxtaposition, he didn't get it. And it was like a huge protest. And, there were some black residents who were like, how can you come here and name your establishment after a derogatory term? And that just, that's this kind of like the history didn't begin until 1991 approach, right? And the truth of the matter is, the ways that we talk about gentrification has to take into account that this improvement, this labor of progress is something that was being done before the arrival of a certain class or a certain racial group.
So there's a question then, I'm just kind of bookmarking this. So the question about institutional memory, community memory, and who plays that role in doing that, especially with the dramatic shifts that begin to happen. So I don't know if either of you wanted to
I just wanted to come back to the nostalgia conversation, because I think it's really interesting the ways in which a lot of gentrifying communities sort of bank on this nostalgia in some ways, this nostalgia of what you described actually, Heather, of safe streets, and your neighbors, and you can go to the community bookstore, and you can go to the restaurant, and you don't have to leave your neighborhood because you know all of your neighbors. And this sort of the myth of what the finally gentrified neighborhood is that it's going to be that. And there's no discussion of what happened to make a neighborhood, disinvested. And so I think that that's kind of an important puzzle piece here is that the sort of reclaiming the city through gentrification is about reclaiming this mythological utopia of what it used to be. And you said something that I wanted to respond to, but now I can't remember what it was. So I'm going to come back to it.
If I can just say one really quick thing, and Heather, it's also about a point that I think you really valuably made, which is the person who's irate that they had to sell their house at a loss, and then you mentioned that this is a white person who's going to be, they feel, have to leave a neighborhood, and what was called blockbusting. And so blockbusting happens at a time in the 1970s where then African-American residents were charged too much to go into that same neighborhood. I think one of the interesting things about looking at neighborhood history, whether in the social sciences or in history, in oral history, is that you have to have this sort of level of radical empathy for people and their stories, where you listen to that story and you think about it and you think about how that person feels about their experience, and then you collect those stories in a fairly impartial way, and then try to add. I think it's incumbent upon social scientists to add an element of economics and political history and looking at the laws and regulations of urban planning to show why those things happen. So not just that they are happening. And I think in that sense, that's the place in which academics get to change a conversation about neighborhood development, because otherwise it can very much be a sort of individual exercise in nostalgia. When I had this house, when the people could play baseball in the streets, and without those stories combined with the socioeconomic facts, it can be a sort of dangerous thing.
But Max, then where do people who are living in those communities actually get to be exposed and be a part of that process, right? So because part of the problem with the academic model of knowledge production is that a book is produced, a study is produced, but do those people in the community actually become a part of that process and actually unpack it in some way in which they have authority and critique as well?
Well, if I can answer that really briefly, I think that there's not a great history of that. I think in sociology, it's been a pretty poor history of sociologists stepping into neighborhoods and using them as the site of knowledge production without invigorating the people they talk to do something about their neighborhood and what's going on there. A lot of that is because sociology for so many years studied neighborhoods and community relationships in the kind of big umbrella category of deviance and social problems, and they really weren't attuned to gentrification. When it happened, it was a bit of a surprise to them, and so they couldn't have a great response to it. I think that oral history has done a somewhat better job because they've looked at going into neighborhoods and collecting stories as not just towards an end product, but a kind of invigorating that community to have that kind of be the springboard to some kind of activism, or at least some kind of productive remembering that could potentially lead to activism. And so maybe it's because I stand outside of that discipline that seems like a more fruitful place to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for our project, this is why we are doing these community workshops. So there's a research workshop where we have pulled archival flyers of tenant organizing or police, there was a famous police brutality case in 1978 where a black businessman was killed in a police chokehold. And it was this huge thing, it led to a 2,000 person march in Crown Heights, right? But this is in 1978, so very few people even know about this, but we know about Eric Garner. So what we hope to do is make those connections for people so that they can see this kind of longer history. And then also by doing the oral history workshops, for example, Brooklyn Movement Center is organizing around police accountability. We've talked with them and we're working with them so that the oral history workshop is designed so that they can see how oral history will help the work that they do. And part of that is holding listening sessions. So we're going to do the oral histories, but also have listening sessions where people come and listen to their neighbors' stories, and also have civic leaders or politicians come and engage in what we call civic listening. Instead of having panelists that speak to the audience, have panelists that listen to what the community has said and respond.
So there's an archival part of what you're talking about, and also there's a dialogic kind of process that you're trying to build into this.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open this up and see if people have comments and questions, and we can kind of come back. Maybe get a few comments and questions, and then that'll help frame some things. So would anybody like to start? Yeah, okay. That's all right. We'll make sure.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I just didn't want to skip over you. I just wanted to go back to the comment about gentrification as being described as a good thing. So I've been particularly concerned recently with like a series of articles in Time and in NPR about how people are not paying enough attention to how gentrification has a host of positive benefits for its neighborhood residents, and kind of trying to say that displacement is a myth. So I guess I just wanted you to engage in that conversation and how we address this kind of surge of scholarship.
Does somebody else have a complementary related comment they want to make? Because we can just bundle a couple of comments here. Okay. Yeah.
I guess this is sort of related, but when they were rezoning in Williamsburg, they were promised a park, and it's a decade later and that park hasn't come. Now they're rezoning in East New York, and the people who are organizing in Williamsburg are warning them, make sure they give you what they promised first before they build all the housing, because they built all the housing, all the luxury people moved in, we don't have those promised benefits. And they're telling them, you know, talk about seats in schools and increased services, public transit, parks, that kind of stuff. So I guess how do you think about the promised benefits, the good part of gentrification to people who are already living there, in balance with all these new units that are being built?
I think one of the challenges, I mean, thank you for your question about this kind of spate of articles or news stories about how great gentrification actually is. I think one of the problems that we're running into a lot, and maybe sociologists can actually help solve this problem, is that it's really hard to figure out where displaced people are going. Where are they displaced to? And so because, you know, city policy, municipal policy comes from data, and there is no data on the displacement, I think it's really difficult to make the argument, even though we have qualitative data and oral histories that say, well, obviously people are being displaced. I also think that, you know, the Real Estate Board of New York City is very powerful when it comes to rent regulation. And rent regulation, it's kind of the death knell of rent regulation is really the reason why displacement is happening. It's not necessarily happening because property values are going up. That's not the only reason. And so I think that may be a part of this story, is that we don't want to talk about rent laws in New York and protecting them. And so if we don't want to talk about that, then it's much easier to just say gentrification's good.
A couple of you raised this question, which I think is a really good one, about how do you do this kind of public history work without then that public history becoming commodified further to further sort of boost the property values. Like, oh, this place has a lot of history. I think the same thing is happening with a kind of superficial racial diversity, cultural diversity as well. These things that we can say are kind of good on the face of it that then become commodified. What do you do in your work to try to prevent that from happening?
Another comment along those lines?
I was wondering, because I took part in Professor Amato's class and we did the whole Los Suarez study, and I come from a different background than most NYU students. So I was wondering, how do you perform these studies? How do you do these surveys? And knowing that you're, say, a white person in a black neighborhood or reverse, how do you kind of get around that and get to like trusting the people, getting the trust of the subjects to get the truest answers, the most honest answers to conduct your studies?
There's a trust question, but there's also the kind of longer term commitment question. So in part, Becky, you've done this 2 years, but 2 years is also a tiny period of time. Part of it, I think, is that you have a long-term relationship with a number of people in that community. But this question of, well, you know, circulation of knowledge and who does it, and then are academics just moving on to the next project or what? All right, so those questions are very, very much a part of this. Anybody else? Okay, so
Well, I can just try to answer those two. I mean, I think you're right, Jack, that having a sustained relationship with the community and a community organization helps to build the trust. So I think that that's, you know, on an individual basis, I think that that was a challenge. And I think that's always going to be a challenge with community engaged research, that the researcher and the person who's being researched, which we in our class called a collaborator, there will be some sort of distance between them until you have a lot of opportunity to get to know each other. So I think that that's a challenge. But in terms of trying to keep things from being commodified, I think if you're doing it on behalf of an organization that has a political agenda, then there's maybe a chance that the historical data that we collected will be used for some purpose that we're trying to aid. And so, I mean, one of the things that was interesting with Los Suras, and I work with them in other capacities as well, is that the tenant organizers have often said to me, one of the problems that we run into in protecting residents of this neighborhood is that those who are in power think this neighborhood has already been gentrified. It's already over and there's nobody left. And we're constantly having to prove that all of these people are still here, people who've been living here for 30 years, people who still need subsidized housing, who still need rent protection, and things like that. And so I think in that way, history projects can be really useful as long as they're, you know, shared with the right people.
I would add that, so oral history as a practice, to your question, there are certain things that you're kind of supposed to do that does lend itself to gaining trust with the narrator. You know, and I think, you know, the idea of shared authority, the idea that the person that, you know, it's not an investigative interview, it's not a journalistic interview. You work with the person, you talk to them about, here are the topics of things we're going to talk about. The release forms are structured so that, you know, people know that they can strike things from the interview if there's something they're not comfortable talking about. So there's, you know, you don't just come into your interview and roll out. Even if you just are there for a project, like, you have to come back to them with the interview and say, here's what it is. Are you comfortable with it? So those kinds of things kind of build trust where people feel like they're not being used or exploited. The longer that a relationship can be, the better it is for the project. And so, I mean, we're fortunate, so we're not driven by a semester schedule. So our project is 2 years. So it allows us to kind of build this relationship. To your question, I mean, I kind of hinted at this with like market-resistant histories. You know, and that means histories that are, the easiest histories to commodify are cultural histories, right? So, you know, like this music, you know, like, I mean, this is what happened to Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene. Like, these musicians came here, these, you know, people lived here, and Biggie lived in this apartment, and, you know, Jay-Z lived here. I mean, so there's this kind of cachet that is easily commodifiable when people talk about, like, the cultural production of a neighborhood. So the histories that we're not ignoring the culture, but we're focusing on, like, the political economy, you know, the history of tenant organizing, the history of activism against police brutality. That's not something that can be, you know, like, no real estate broker is going to be like, and Arthur Miller was killed in a chokehold on this corner. Like, that's not something that you would sell, right? But it's still part of that history. At the same time, you know, we don't want to have, like, I mean, people have immense pride in their neighborhoods, right? They have a great sense of celebration about where they live, and we also want to convey that as well. And so that's the kind of the counter-hegemonic mapping where, you know, this this might be a project, but it might be a place where you know, had this great great basketball game one time where you know, scored, I don't know, 30 points, right? And so, like, that might be someone's highlight. Or this corner was where you always gathered after school. I mean, I interviewed this one elderly woman, and, you know, her favorite place was, like, the walk from her house to her elementary school. So there's, like, a passageway and she remembered all the stops along the way, all the people she spoke to, Mrs. So-and-so on the stoop, Mr. So-and-so crossing the street. Like, so this is the, you know, that's not something that would be marketable, but it would actually kind of counter the kind of marketing of the neighborhood.
If I can just add something to that great point, I think there's a way in which you definitely see this happening all the time when people are picking what kind of histories to present. And the biggest way, in my mind, is architectural history, where you see, the Corinthian columns, the Art Deco details, the number of rooms, the where the stone came from, and you have to ask yourself this question of, did anyone ever live here ever?
Right.
And so it becomes that the human history is erased, and a lot of times when the human history is erased, it's a first step in some dramatic neighborhood changes. In response to your question, I think it's also all about who you partner with. There's been a lot of skepticism in social sciences about partnering with anyone because there's been a negative history of paternalism, starting in the 1920s with the settlement houses and going forward. But I think at this point, social scientists have learned their lesson and need to start doing research in service of groups that are already on the ground, doing research in those communities and listening to them about what kind of work they need to be done in order to stay in their homes or in order to learn more about their neighborhoods. The slide I didn't get to talk about here is about this book, Evicted, which is a study in Milwaukee after the 2008 financial crisis, which does just that and goes from the starting point of working with neighborhood activists and anti-eviction activists to see what they can use from a social scientist. And it sounds obvious, but it was a very new way of doing things, and that was just a couple years ago.
So if I may just piggyback on that, another hat that I wear is I direct an institute where we do transformational service learning. And as part of that, we actually surveyed communities. What do they need from us when we send students into the community? What kind of research do they need? And what we heard over and over is they need us to help them with program evaluation, not exactly the kind of research we want to be doing, but it is what the community needed. But also that they had an entire history of working with universities that would come in, do these studies, and then when there was grant money available, the universities would swoop in and take the grant money. So they needed a university partner that would actually come in and help them build resources and social capital in the way that they needed it built. And I'll just tell you very quickly, we are on the ground opening the first restorative justice community court for young adults, the 18 to 25-year-olds, in the North Lawndale community of Chicago, which has among the highest rates of incarceration. The 18 to 24-year-olds who are sitting in adult prisons because, we've got all this executive functioning stuff we know about, but we continue to incarcerate these young people. But that came about through efforts of us working through the community, and now our students are out doing surveys along with community members in the community. It doesn't speak to the history and the oral history, but it does speak to the question of what communities need, and then as universities, what is our responsibility to those communities?
Got a couple more questions, and we've got a little bit of time left, so maybe we can just get a bunch of comments, and then the last round of responses.
Just coming from a really non-academic point of view, and I hope I'm not asking something that's already been covered, but I wonder what the challenges are and the opportunities you see in sharing these non-marketable stories. It sounds like the Brooklyn Historical Society has a podcast, but what barriers are there, what challenges are there to sharing these stories? To me, oral history sounds fascinating, and I'd love to listen to some, but to others, I can imagine it sounds like really dreary. So how do you kind of make this stuff interesting so that it's people want to learn about this stuff?
So I was wondering, in terms of oral histories, to what extent do you think that people who maybe aren't part of the marginalized communities or the displaced communities, but maybe were part of the first wave of gentrification, or people who don't necessarily fit what we would think of as the people who get heard through oral histories, do you think that they have a place in oral histories, and how would you balance that if the point of the oral histories is partly to give voices to people who are unheard? Do you think that maybe voices of people who have been historically more heard still have a place in that?
I actually had a question very much related to that. I think it was really interesting in hearing more about like the history of ethnography. It was very much in this idea of like, we're gonna go study a problem, and specifically it feels like that always focuses on like a marginalized community. And in this context of like displacement, the quote that was on the board really stood out to me. Like, it's not the the people who are moving in that's at fault here. It's the landlords. So like, where are the ethnographies of the landlords? Like, if we're going to say there's a problem here and we're going to study the problem, then I'm just curious if that's like an area of research that people are looking into.
In light of Mayor Bloomberg's rezoning in 2002, he rezoned 1/3 of the city's land. My question is do you think that in light of mass rezoning, which was like the first rezoning to have happened in New York City in a really long time that dramatically shifted the landscape, do you think that neighborhoods as a static concept is really a thing of the past? And being that it's just 1/3 and there's intensive capital mobility flowing into the city internationally and even just amongst the nation, do you think that we could truly preserve communities as they once were, static and enclaves of working class and people in light of basically open capital mobility in today's everything?
So yeah, actually, if I just take that thing about neighborhoods as static concepts and then go back to neighborhoods, we're all talking about neighborhoods that have changed a lot, and it's really about who you can speak to and where the neighborhood is. So obviously people stay in neighborhoods for various reasons, sometimes because they can't leave, sometimes because they want to, sometimes people leave because they want to, sometimes people leave because they have to. But obviously if you're doing something about documenting neighborhood change, it's much easier to find the people who are still in the neighborhood. It's very hard to find the people who aren't there and to get those stories, but that's a lot of stories that are lost. I would say it feeds into these questions of nostalgia we were talking about. So it was really to ask, to what extent is documenting neighborhood change like compromised when you can't reach part of the neighborhood, and how do you attempt to alleviate that?
Okay, I know this is a lot of questions, so maybe you can just kind of think about one that you want to really respond
Could we actually get that one in the back?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, good.
I'm curious to know a little bit more about your thoughts regarding what might be construed as hyper-ghettoization, and I'm thinking about kind of like historically the ways in, the historical precedent of white flight and the ways in which the gentry is in many ways just moving into spaces that have been historically disinvested or abandoned or whatever you want to call, and also in relation to the fact that New York City has a housing stock that is larger than the city of Boston. So I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of what your question was about. Maybe displacement isn't about people having to leave their neighborhoods, but also about further social isolation and policing. And I'm curious a little bit about how that shows up in your research and your ethnographies and all of this.
Yeah, and part of this question really is about unpacking this conglomerate term of gentrification, right, and kind of breaking it down more. So one more.
So I was part of Rebecca's study on cultural displacement, and I was one of the collaborators or subjects or whatever you want to call it. And I see a lot of these. I have a few comments, and one about that nostalgia comment is that it's kind of interesting to me. I found that what Heather there said about the whites in those neighborhoods, that they had all this nostalgia until, and I have the same kind of I have the same feeling, my neighborhood wasn't the greatest, it wasn't the safest, it wasn't the best, but it was mine until gentrification, neocolonialism, displacement, whatever you want to call it. And it isn't and it's very hard to pin down what that actually means, because you talked about something about a first wave of, it wasn't a wave, it was like insidious. It was little by little, and then it was all at once. It wasn't something that we could change. We were never asked. Somebody mentioned the Bloomberg rezoning laws. Williamsburg was mostly an industrial zone until Bloomberg changed a lot of that. And so it isn't something that we can stop. Honestly, in New York is constantly changing. We say that, but we were never asked. There was never you never are asked, I think. And I think the work you guys do is very important, and not just because you go and do the study and then you leave, and then the neighborhoods are still there. There's still people there having to deal with those things, and I think it's up. I think what you there was this question about what you need to do, or what you need to happen. But I think just doing the study gives people there a sense of agency, and that their stories are important, that their neighborhoods are important, and to keep them there is an important thing. And just from me, just from doing this study with Rebecca, I started getting active in the community. I'm part of this. We started a block association. We just recently shut down a meeting that they had about a new development that was going to be racist and leave a lot of the neighborhood out of it. So I think, that it helps.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I'm overcome actually by hearing that, so thank you very much. I wanted to say about collecting histories of other people involved in gentrification. We did that our first year. We didn't do oral histories, we did interviews, so they weren't formal in any way, and we didn't do a lot of training, but we did interviews with people who were artists who had moved into Williamsburg in the 1980s and into Bushwick in the 1980s and 90s. So we have collected some of those stories. I think it's hard when you look at a process as being kind of a rights issue to want to cover the process as an abstraction, gentrification, and say, I'm really interested in the landlords, and I'm really interested in, the real estate people and all those kinds of things. And, those of you who heard There Goes the Neighborhood on WNYC, they did a great job of doing that, but I wasn't really interested in that. I was interested in the people who were being displaced, and I was interested in the neighborhood as it was. And I have no, illusions of neighborhoods staying static, but I do want to believe that a city can have enough capacity for people of different races and economic status and protect people who don't have resources. And so even if I don't think that, South Los Suras is going to be Los Suras forever, I would like to think the people who live there have an opportunity to stay where they are if they want to. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel maybe ethically about the process. So I'm really glad if it does have an impact in some way and allows people to stay where they are and fight back.
Yeah, I think, so the way that I'm thinking about this, and I appreciate those questions about the neighborhood not being static or, different people living in a neighborhood. I'm thinking of the kind of concept of scale, spatial scale, where you can have people occupying the same place, but it functions as a different space for the people depending on where they are. So that, a building for one person is a school, for another person is a place of miseducation, right? And so that's thinking about scale, right? And I think for us, I think it's something we hope to document. So we have actually some people that we want to interview, some business owners, both new and old, again to illustrate this concept of scale, that you can simultaneously occupy a place, but it functions completely different for you, right? So even just what people call Crown Heights is dependent on who that person is, right? Some people call parts of what we call Crown Heights Bed-Stuy, because at a certain point, Bed-Stuy was just like the catch-all for Central Brooklyn, for specifically Black Brooklyn. And so if you're familiar with the geography of Crown Heights, north of Eastern Parkway was where you had a predominantly Black population. South of Eastern Parkway was significant Hasidic population. It was about 30% white, still not predominantly white. But, if you talk to some members of the Hasidic community, they would say, this is Crown Heights, that's Bed-Stuy, right? And you would have, and there were Black people who were like, we live in Bed-Stuy, but it was Crown Heights. And I think that's a question of scale, right? It's a question of people occupying the same place, but it functions spatially very differently because of their own location, both in terms of class and ethnicity. And I think it's important to illustrate that.
And if I could just piggyback, then realtors have their own definition based on test scores and what they can get for property. So there's always that struggle as well.
If I can say with this one, to answer a couple of these questions, it sounds like a lot of people who are interested here about scale are actually interested in sort of gentrification beyond the city, which is that you're asking questions about how can you really know the experience of gentrification displacement if you're just looking at the people who are still there. So instead of people who have perhaps left voluntarily or who have been displaced in earlier waves, maybe less aggressively, maybe more aggressively. And I think that in some ways, and also this question of, where do people move to? Are neighborhoods even important? When you have Russian sort of blind companies that you have no idea who the owner is, buying tons of real estate in Midtown Manhattan, how much does national scale even matter? And I think that one thing that gentrification studies and people who are interested in gentrification have not been great about, which maybe we should get better about, is looking at this kind of larger scale. And particularly in terms of displacement, because so many people are being forced to leave the metropolitan area and perhaps even the tri-state area here in New York. And so if this election has put anything into focus about winning and losing regions and people who are in entire regions where they feel like they've been left behind and they're bereft of opportunity, I think that can inform what we're thinking about in terms of the city, because the city isn't just a city anymore.
Just to maybe address some of the other questions, is that what does it mean to be an ally, perhaps, whether from an academic position or from an organizational position or from students who may come from different communities and are working through a course or whatever in a particular community? Because in some ways that's something that's undergirding a lot of this. How can people feel comfortable working in a community that's not of theirs, quote unquote, but then be trying to move things in a direction that they feel is a good direction. So, maybe just quick response from each of you, and then we should probably wrap up after that.
So again, we do transformational service learning, and I think that the work that we do in communities must be driven by what the community needs. There is a reciprocal process. Our students learn from the community as we engage in efforts that are going to be helpful and useful for the community. I think that anything else is perhaps exploiting the community, and I think it's really dangerous when universities come in with an idea of how and what will be best for communities. So I'll just leave it there.
I like the term accomplice instead of ally, that you are helping people accomplish what is important and necessary for them, because we're not in this together. Our institution is in a very privileged place, and to present ourselves as allies would kind of belie that kind of disparity. And so we have to step down and say, how can we help you accomplish what will help you? And that's how we've approached all of our partners and affiliates. How would this help you? And some people are like, it won't. And so we're not going to waste your time if it won't help you.
I agree with what you've both said. I'd also say that in our class we focused a lot on listening, and so if the exchange is that you're going to sit and listen and not interrupt, and you're then going to learn something. As an NYU student, from somebody who's fighting to stay in her or his home. Then I think that becomes a more even exchange, because you're already coming in from a place of privilege. You're already being seen as somebody who has privilege. But if you're going to stop talking and listen for a second, you're already kind of beginning to equalize some of the conversation.
I can't add anything to those great points. So,
I was given permission to make a plug for an event that we're having that's actually totally relevant to all of what we're talking about. This Saturday, the AP Institute, which I am involved in at NYU, has been working with a group of Lenape to really ask the question of what does it mean to begin to have Lenape, who have been dispersed and pushed out of New York City since 1609, to begin to come back and reclaim a presence here. So we've been working with that community, well, parts of that community for a couple of years, and representatives from the 5 nations, the 5 recognized nations of Lenape peoples will be there to be a part of this discussion. But it's an even more complex process. So I just wanted to invite you all to come. I have flyers if you want to take them. And please join me in thanking this really terrific panel.
Yeah.